There's a chilling pattern in history that has toppled the world's most powerful governments, and right now, the United States is following it step by step. If you think revolutions are ancient history, think again, because the warning signs that once shook France, Russia, and Cuba are flashing red in America today. In 1789, France was the envy of Europe, but beneath the glittering surface, a tiny elite hoarded wealth while millions starved. Within years, the monarchy was gone and chaos reigned. Russia's empire collapsed in months after years of corruption, war, and a middle class that lost all hope. Cuba, once a playground for the rich, fell to revolution when the people realized the system would never change. Each time, the same six-stage pattern played out: extreme inequality, government corruption, a radicalized middle class, loss of faith in institutions, mass support for revolution, and finally, the collapse of the old order. Sound familiar? In America today, the wealth gap is wider than ever. Trust in government is at rock bottom, and millions of educated young people feel betrayed by a system that promised them everything and delivered nothing. Rumors swirl online about unrest, with some speculating that the next spark could come from a contested election, a viral incident, or an economic crash. The anger is real, and history shows that when peaceful change feels impossible, people look for more drastic answers. The terrifying truth is that revolutions don't start with the poorest. They start when those with the most to lose decide they have nothing left. The United States is now deep into the same pattern that once destroyed empires, and the next stage could arrive faster than anyone expects. Throughout history, revolutions have never been random explosions of chaos. They follow a chillingly predictable pattern, one that has repeated itself with devastating consequences across centuries and continents. This six-stage sequence is like a hidden script, quietly unfolding beneath the surface of society until suddenly everything erupts. The first stage always begins with extreme wealth inequality. It's not just about some people being rich and others being poor. It's about a gap so wide, so visible, that it becomes impossible to ignore. The elite live in a different world, untouched by the struggles of ordinary people, flaunting their privilege while the majority can barely get by. This isn't just unfair, it breeds resentment, a slow-burning anger that simmers for years. But inequality alone isn't enough to spark a revolution. The second stage is government corruption and incompetence. When those in power are seen as self-serving, out of touch, or simply unable to solve the problems facing their country, trust evaporates. People stop believing that the system works for them. They see politicians enriching themselves, scandals swept under the rug, and basic needs ignored. The government becomes a symbol of everything that's broken, and the idea of reform starts to feel like a cruel joke. Then comes the third stage, the destruction and radicalization of the middle class. This is the tipping point. Revolutions don't start with the poorest. They ignite when the educated, the professionals, the people who should be invested in stability, lose faith. When teachers, lawyers, engineers, and small business owners realize that no matter how hard they work, the deck is stacked against them, they become desperate for change. Their frustration turns into action, and suddenly, the backbone of society is pushing for something drastic. The fourth stage is the loss of faith in institutions. Courts, police, elections, the media. These are the pillars that hold a country together. But when people stop believing in them, when every decision is seen as rigged or corrupt, the social contract shatters. It's no longer about left versus right or rich versus poor. It's about a fundamental belief that nothing can be fixed from within. At this point, the fifth stage arrives. Revolutionary movements gain mass support. Organized groups, often led by charismatic or ruthless leaders, step into the vacuum. They promise justice, revenge, a new beginning. People rally behind them, not always because they believe in the cause, but because they're desperate for anything different. The moderates are pushed aside, and the extremes take center stage. Finally, the sixth stage. The government is overthrown, and chaos follows. The old order collapses, and what replaces it is rarely what the revolutionaries promised. Instead of freedom and prosperity, there's often violence, purges, and new forms of oppression. The cycle of hope and betrayal repeats, leaving a trail of shattered lives and broken nations. Understanding this six-stage pattern isn't just an academic exercise, it's a warning. Every time this sequence has played out, the people in power believed it couldn't happen to them. They thought their country was too stable, too advanced, too exceptional. But history doesn't care about confidence or tradition. The pattern is ruthless, and once it reaches a certain point, it accelerates with terrifying speed. Recognizing these stages as they unfold is the only way to see what's coming before it's too late. Because by the time the final act begins, the chance to change course has usually vanished. In 1789, France was the crown jewel of Europe, rich, cultured, and seemingly unshakable. Paris dazzled as the world's center of art and philosophy, and the monarchy had ruled for centuries. But beneath the glittering surface, the country was rotting. The elite, clergy, and nobility lived in unimaginable luxury, paying no taxes while the vast majority, nearly 98% of the population, struggled under crushing burdens. Bread, the staple of life, became a luxury as prices soared and the people's anger simmered. This was stage one, extreme inequality, so blatant it poisoned every corner of society. Stage two arrived as government corruption and incompetence became impossible to ignore. King Louis XVI wasn't a tyrant, but he was weak, indecisive, and utterly disconnected from the suffering outside his palace walls. France was drowning in debt, yet the solution was always the same: raise taxes on those who could least afford it, while the privileged few blocked any real reform. The system was rigged, and everyone knew it. Then came stage three, the radicalization of the middle class. Lawyers, merchants, and educated citizens who should have been the backbone of stability instead became the engine of revolution. When the king refused to give them a real voice, they broke away, forming the National Assembly and vowing to create a new order. The spark was lit, and the storming of the Bastille made it clear that the old rules no longer applied. Stage four followed as faith in every institution collapsed. The monarchy, the church, the courts, none could be trusted. The revolutionaries tore down the old structures, abolishing feudalism and seizing church lands, but it was never enough. The hunger for change only grew. Stage five exploded as the revolutionary movement gained mass support. The moderates were swept aside by the Jacobins, who promised justice and vengeance. The king was executed, and the streets ran red during the Reign of Terror as thousands were killed in the name of purity. Finally, stage six. The government was overthrown, but instead of peace, France descended into chaos. The revolution devoured its own leaders, and after a decade of bloodshed, Napoleon seized power, replacing dreams of liberty with a military dictatorship. In 1917, Russia was a colossal empire stretching from Europe to the Pacific, ruled by the Romanovs for over 3 centuries. On the surface, it was a land of palaces, grand balls, and imperial power. But beneath that glittering facade, the country was suffocating under medieval inequality. The Tsar and his nobles owned nearly everything, while peasants, 80% of the population, owned nothing and lived in grinding poverty. Factory workers in the cities toiled for starvation wages, children worked dangerous jobs, and the elite remained oblivious to the suffering all around them. This was stage one, a society split by a chasm so wide it could not be bridged. Stage two arrived as government corruption and incompetence became impossible to ignore. Tsar Nicholas II clung to the belief that he ruled by divine right, refusing to reform or even acknowledge the misery of his people. When peaceful protesters marched to the Winter Palace in 1905, they were met with gunfire, shattering any illusion that the regime cared for its citizens. World War I only made things worse. Millions died, the army was in shambles, and the Tsar's advisors, including the infamous Rasputin, made disastrous decisions. The government was seen as hopelessly corrupt and out of touch. Stage 3 erupted as the middle class and even the military turned against the regime. Bread riots in Petrograd brought workers and soldiers together, and when the army refused to fire on the crowds, the Tsar's power evaporated overnight. The Duma forced Nicholas to abdicate, ending 300 years of Romanov rule in a matter of days. Stage 4 set in as the new provisional government quickly lost legitimacy. They promised reform but kept Russia in the war, and the people's patience snapped. Into this chaos stepped Lenin and the Bolsheviks, promising peace, land, and bread. Stage 5 saw the revolutionary movement gain mass support as desperate people rallied behind the promise of a new order. The Bolsheviks seized power in a near-bloodless coup, but what followed was anything but peaceful. Stage 6 unleashed total chaos, civil war, famine, and purges that killed millions. The revolution that began with hope ended in terror, as the new regime proved even more ruthless than the old. In the 1950s, Cuba was the sparkling jewel of the Caribbean, famous for its nightlife, casinos, and a standard of living that outshone much of Latin America. Havana was a playground for American tourists and wealthy locals, with neon lights, luxury hotels, and non-stop parties. But behind the glamour, the country was rotting from the inside. The wealth was concentrated in the hands of a tiny elite, while rural Cubans lived in poverty, working endless hours on sugar plantations owned by foreign companies. The government, led by Fulgencio Batista, was a dictatorship built on corruption and fear. Elections were a sham, the police could be bought, and anyone who spoke out risked torture or disappearance. This was stage 1 and 2 combined: extreme inequality and a government that existed only to serve itself. The middle class, especially young, educated Cubans, saw their country being looted and their future stolen. Instead of joining the elite, they turned against it. Fidel Castro, a lawyer from a privileged background, became the face of resistance. After a failed uprising and time in prison, he returned with a handful of followers, surviving against all odds in the mountains. Batista's brutal crackdowns only fueled the fire, as every act of violence created more rebels. The people lost faith in every institution, courts, police, even the press, knowing everything was rigged. As the revolution gained momentum, Castro's movement swelled with support from peasants, students, and even disillusioned soldiers. By 1959, Batista's regime collapsed almost overnight, and Castro marched into Havana to the cheers of a nation desperate for change. But the promise of freedom quickly vanished. Political opponents were rounded up, trials and executions became routine, and the press was silenced. Castro nationalized everything, and those who resisted were imprisoned or fled the country. The revolution that began with hope ended in dictatorship and repression, as Cuba traded one form of tyranny for another, and the dream of paradise became a prison for generations. Look at America in 2025, and the echoes of history are impossible to ignore. The wealth gap has reached levels that would make even the French aristocracy blush, with the top fraction of a percent controlling more than the bottom 90% combined. Private jets and mega mansions are flaunted on social media while millions struggle to pay rent or buy groceries. This isn't just about money. It's about a sense of injustice that's fueling resentment across the country. Meanwhile, trust in government has collapsed. Congress is less popular than ever, and every new scandal, whether it's insider trading, lobbyist influence, or accusations of election interference, feeds the belief that the system is hopelessly corrupt. Social media is ablaze with rumors and speculation. Some claim that secret deals are being made behind closed doors. Others warn that the next election could be the spark that ignites mass unrest. There are viral posts about states preparing for secession, whispers of military leaders quietly choosing sides, and conspiracy theories about foreign powers waiting to exploit American chaos. While much of this is unverified, the fact that so many people believe it shows just how fragile the national psyche has become. The middle class, once the backbone of stability, is being hollowed out. Young people with degrees and ambition are drowning in debt, unable to afford homes or start families, and many feel betrayed by a system that promised them the American dream. This frustration is turning into anger, and that anger is looking for an outlet. On one side, there's a growing movement demanding radical change, calls for wealth redistribution, universal health care, and a total overhaul of the system. On the other, there's a surge in support for strongman leaders and talk of taking drastic measures to restore order. Both sides are losing faith in the institutions that once held the country together. Courts, police, the media, none are trusted, and every new controversy only deepens the divide. The psychological trigger is clear. When people stop believing that peaceful reform is possible, they start looking for more extreme answers. The social contract is fraying, and the sense of unity that once defined America is being replaced by suspicion, fear, and a readiness for confrontation. History doesn't just repeat itself, it warns those willing to listen. Every time a nation has ignored the widening gap between rich and poor, brushed off government corruption, and dismissed the anger of its own people, the result has been disaster. France, Russia, and Cuba all believed they were too advanced, too stable, too exceptional to fall. But the same six-stage pattern swept them into chaos and left scars that lasted for generations. The lesson is brutally clear. Revolutions don't erupt out of nowhere. They build slowly, fueled by resentment, broken promises, and the steady erosion of trust. When the middle class loses hope, when institutions lose legitimacy, and when people start to believe that nothing will ever change, the stage is set for upheaval. In America today, every warning sign is flashing. The wealth gap is wider than ever. Faith in government is at an all-time low, and millions are searching for someone to blame. Rumors and speculation about unrest are spreading faster than facts, and the country feels more divided than united. If the pattern continues, the next stages could arrive with a speed and violence that will shock even the most cynical observers. The real danger isn't just in the collapse of old systems, but in what comes after. Because history shows that revolutions rarely deliver the freedom and justice they promise. Instead, they often bring new forms of oppression, deeper divisions, and a long, painful road to recovery. So the question isn't whether America is immune to the forces that have toppled other great nations, it's whether we're willing to recognize the signs before it's too late. If the past is any guide, ignoring these warnings is the most dangerous choice of all. What kind of future are we really heading toward, and will we see the next stage coming before it's already here?